The wind at Wolf Pass smelled of iron and wet stone. Kalen Rowe stood at the edge of the scree and listened as the gate creaked behind him. Heavy oak leaves with iron strips. The last sound of Westmark. The escort had already turned their horses around and were riding down the winding road without looking back. Not a single one looked him in the face. For 8 years he had led the way for these men. He read the tracks for them. He mapped out fords. He'd blazed trails along which entire regiments would later march. And now they'd left him a knife and a half-empty canteen and shut the gate. That little act of cruelty with the canteen was Sergeant Grevy's signature. He'd always liked to add a pinch of humiliation to his orders. Kalen adjusted the canteen strap on his shoulder and looked down. The uplands lay before him like an open wound in the earth. The gray folds of the mountain ranges stretched northward. Red patches of clay-colored bare spots. Sparse wisps of smoke rising from the gorges. Somewhere out there lived more than 40 tribes. Each had its own god. Its own score to settle with the people of the plains. Its own name for that well around which they had been slaughtering one another for more than a century. Kalen knew this better than any other scout in the 2nd Border Corps. That was precisely why Marshal Holbrook had chosen him. Not because he hated him, but because Kalen knew too much. He knew that the maps of the northern passes were being redrawn. He knew that the quartermasters were stockpiling mountain rations for 10,000 men. He knew what that meant. War. A great war for the range. And the marshal didn't just need a dead scout. A dead scout means questions. It means an investigation. It means inconvenient paperwork. But an exiled traitor is a completely different matter. The planted correspondence with the Wind Clan chieftain was found in his duffel bag, so conveniently that even the tribunal sat for only one evening. A closed-door session. 3 officers with stony faces. The verdict: exile beyond the mountain range with no right of return. In Westmark, this was considered more merciful than the gallows. Only in theory, no one ever returned from beyond the fangs. Kalen stood before the 3 officers then and looked them in the eye. Not a single one could hold his gaze. He was searching the room for one face, Daria's. She was sitting in the 3rd row, hands on her knees, eyes fixed on the floor. She remained silent. She had a voice. She could have stood up and said the correspondence was forged, that Kalen had been with her that night when he was supposedly meeting with the Wind Clan chieftain. But she remained silent, and he didn't blame her. He understood. Her career, fear, a system that grinds down anyone who speaks out. He understood all of that with his head, but inside, something snapped and never mended. Now at the pass, he wasn't thinking about Daria. He was thinking about the marshal. Holbrook had been too lazy. True mercy is a noose, quick and clean. But this was a way to ensure that in 6 months' time, people would be telling stories around the campfires about how Rowe had incited the savages against the crown, and no one would ask who had thrown him there in the first place. Kalen sat down on a rock. His knees were aching from the 3-day climb. The convoy had been moving fast. They hadn't really been fed, just bread and water. Now there was hardly any water left. He shook the canteen. 3 sips. Maybe 4 if he stretched it out. Down below, it was about a 4-hour walk to the nearest smoke rising from the gorge. Maybe 5 over the scree. And they weren't waiting for him there with open arms. They were waiting for him with spears. He said one word out loud, just to hear his own voice. All right. Then he added more quietly, for 8 years I've been drawing maps for someone else's war. I'll draw one for myself. And at that moment, the sky before his eyes trembled. It didn't darken. It didn't flash. It was as if it had parted. Over the real mountains, others appeared. Semi-transparent. Neat. Outlined with fine lines, just like the best blueprints from the royal chamber. Kalen froze. His breath caught. He could see an underground stream running beneath the red clay 300 paces to the northeast. A thin blue vein. It dived beneath the rock and emerged as a stream somewhere at the base. He saw a yellow spot deep within the rock. Copper. Too deep to reach with his bare hands, but close enough to hold promise. He saw a thin dotted line along the cliff face. An old trail. A goat path. Forgotten by everyone except the mountain itself. Kalen very slowly dropped to one knee. Not out of weakness, out of something else. For 8 years he had read the land with his fingers and eyes. He'd pressed his ear against the rock, tasted the soil, sniffed the wind. He'd done everything a good scout does to understand the terrain. And now the earth itself had spoken to him. He didn't understand how. He didn't understand why. But he'd been a scout for 8 years, and a scout's first rule is simple. When you're given information, you use it first. Questions come later. He stood up. He slung his canteen over his shoulder. And he set off toward the northeast, toward the blue vein beneath the red clay. Downward. Towards Zagorja. To the place where they were supposed to hate him. The descent took the rest of the day. The scree was treacherous. The fine gravel beneath his feet shifted as if alive. Twice he slipped and clung to the ledges with his bare hands. He scraped the skin on his palms down to the flesh. But the map didn't fade. It hung before his eyes like a second layer of the world. Detailed and precise. The blue vein of water grew brighter as he drew nearer. By sunset, he had reached the spot. A reddish rock jutted out of the slope like a fist. Beneath it lay a dry riverbed. The stones were gray and lifeless. Not a blade of grass. Any scout would have passed it by. But the map told a different story. The map said that beneath these dead rocks, 3 man-heights deep, clear water flowed. Kalen sat down by the rock. He was so thirsty his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He finished the flask. 2 gulps. He looked at the dry bed. He had nothing to dig with. A knife isn't a shovel. He needed people. He needed hands. But the people here wanted to kill him. He lay down on the rocks and closed his eyes. The map glowed even through his eyelids. Quiet and still. As if the earth were telling him there was no need to rush. That it would wait. He fell asleep with that thought. And the next morning, a spear at his throat woke him. The spear was made of bone. The tip was carved from the horn of a mountain goat, not iron. So it wasn't Westmark. It was the tribe. Kalen opened his eyes slowly. 8 men stood over him. Their skin was dark from the sun and wind. Their hands were covered in red clay up to the elbows. The red clay people. He knew of them from old reports, a tribe of medium size, about 400 people. They live in the gorges of the southern slope. They fire clay. They make pottery. They rarely go to war, but when they do, it's to the death. A young warrior with a narrow face and a scar across his eyebrow held a spear. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes didn't blink. He was waiting for a command. The command was to come from the old man who stood slightly behind him, lean as dried meat. His cheekbones were sun-baked to the color of dark copper. His eyes were narrow and unblinking. The chieftain. The old man looked down at Kalen, then at his clothes. A Westmark cloak, army boots, a standard reconnaissance knife on his belt. All of this spoke louder than any words. A man from the plains, a soldier, an enemy. The chieftain uttered a single word. Kalen knew that word. It sounded like a hoarse exhalation. Water. In the red clay language, that word meant at once a greeting, a question, and a verdict. You've come for our water. Kalen didn't move. The spear was still pressed against the skin beneath his chin. He spoke in their dialect, poorly, with an accent that grated on the ear, but clearly. He said he hadn't come for their water. He said he would show them another source. Silence. The young warrior with the spear glanced sideways at the chief. The old man didn't move. He looked at Kalen the way one looks at a rock that wasn't there on the trail before. Not with hatred, with assessment. Then the chief said one more word. Day. Kalen understood. He was given 1 day. If he didn't show them the water by sunset, the spear would pierce his throat. A fair deal by the standards of Zagor. They lifted him to his feet. Not roughly, but not gently either. 2 warriors stood on either side of him. Kalen stretched his neck. The spear had left a thin scratch beneath his chin. The blood had already dried. He looked at the chieftain and asked if he would come with him. The old man was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. The 4 of them walked together. Kalen in front, the chieftain behind him, 2 warriors on either side. The map unfolded before his eyes the moment he took his first step. A blue vein of water stretched toward the northeast. Bright and clear. But now Kalen saw more. He saw the red clay people's encampment, smoke, warmth, several dozen shelters made of stone and animal hides in a gorge an hour's walk away. And he saw their well, or rather, what was left of it. A dull gray speck, almost dead. The well was drying up. It had been 3 months without decent water. That's why they'd found him so quickly. They weren't looking for him. They were looking for water. They'd been scouring the old riverbeds, checking every crevice in the rock. And they'd stumbled upon a stranger. Kalen led them down the slope, past dry boulders, past cracks in the rock from which not even moss grew. The land here was harsh and barren, He understood why the tribes were killing each other. People don't fight over land like this out of greed. They fight over it out of desperation. Half an hour later, they came out to a dry riverbed. The chief stopped. His face hardened. He said that this was a place they called dead, that there had been no water here for as long as 3 generations could remember, that no one came here. Kalen nodded. He understood. The riverbed looked dead, gray rocks, not a trace of moisture, not a single patch of green. But the map told a different story. The map showed a blue vein running directly beneath this spot, deep down, as deep as 3 grown men. But it was there, clear, alive, flowing. Kalen walked up to the red rock. He stood in its shadow. He looked down at his feet. The map pulsed. The blue line was so bright that he was almost surprised the others couldn't see it. He pointed downward. Here, dig here. The chief looked at him for a long time, then at the dry earth, then back at him. There was no faith in the old man's eyes. But there was a thirst, not his own, but the thirst of the 400 people behind him, children, the elderly, and women with infants at their breasts. When the well had been dry for 3 months, the chief was ready to dig even where a stranger from the plains had pointed. The old man gave the order. By noon, 12 men had gathered at the red rock, armed with pickaxes made of stone and horn. Kalen watched them work. Their hands were strong. Their blows were precise. Red clay flew in all directions. Beneath the clay lay gray sandstone, hard. The pickaxes rang out. The men took turns every hour. Kalen measured the depth. An adult man's height is about 170 palms. 3 times that height means about 500 palms. They dug all day. The pit was now 2 heights deep. The sandstone gave way to softer rock. That was a good sign. The map confirmed it. The blue vein was close. The chieftain sat on the edge of the pit and said nothing. The warriors stood around him. Kalen could feel their eyes on him. If there was no water, a spear would find his throat faster than he could take a step. As darkness fell, they lit the torches. No one left. No one went to sleep. They dug by the light of the fire. The blows of the pickaxes sounded hollow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Kalen stood at the edge and looked down. The map said there wasn't much left. The blue vein was right beneath them. He could sense it just as a scout senses a shift in the wind. With his whole body. At a depth of 3 man heights, one of the digger's pickaxes sank into soft ground. The man froze. He raised his pickaxe. Wet sand clung to the blade. Silence fell like a stone. Then one of the warriors leaned forward. The digger struck again. And again. The sand was getting wetter and wetter. After a few more strikes, water began to seep out from under the rock. It didn't gush out. It didn't gush out like a fountain. It simply began quietly and steadily to fill the bottom of the pit. Clean. Clear. Kalen watched from above and felt something inside him ease. Not joy. Something simpler and more ancient than joy. He had found water for the people who wanted to kill him. And it was the right thing to do. The chief climbed down into the pit. The old man moved nimbly for his age. He crouched down. He scooped up water with his palm, brought it to his lips. He drank for a long time. Then he straightened up and looked up at Kalen. The torches illuminated his face from below. His wrinkles deepened. His eyes shone. He climbed back up in silence. He approached Kalen. He removed a bone amulet on a leather cord from around his neck. Kalen knew what it was. The chieftain's personal protection symbol. Whoever wears this amulet is under the protection of the chieftain and his spears. To kill the wearer is to declare war on the entire tribe. The old man placed the amulet around Kalen's neck. The bone was warm from the other man's body. The chieftain spoke words that Kalen would remember for the rest of his life. The old man said that Kalen was not a man of the plains. He said that Kalen was the one who hears the water. The 8 spears that had stood against him that morning now stood behind him. Kalen touched the amulet on his chest. The bone was smooth and warm. He thought that this was the first thing he'd been given in the backlands. Not taken away. They hadn't thrown it away. They'd given it to him. And at that thought, his throat tightened more than it did from thirst. Kalen spent the next 4 days at the red clay camp. The gorge was narrow and deep. The red stone walls rose to the height of a 10-story building. Below, Shelters were crammed together, stone walls, roofs made of animal hides and twigs. Between them were narrow passages where two people could not pass each other. 400 people lived here, crammed together like sardines. Cramped, hot by day, cold by night. Children ran around naked from the waist up. Women fired clay in low kilns. Men sharpened bone arrowheads and remained silent. No one bothered Kalen. The chieftain's amulet worked better than any wall. But they watched. They watched constantly. His every step, every gesture. He felt those gazes on his back like tiny pricks. On the second day, a girl approached him. She was short. Her dark hair was braided into 4 plaits, according to the custom of the red clay people. Her hands were clean, not covered in clay. So she wasn't a potter or a laborer. She spoke to him in the language of Westmark, with an accent but clearly. Kalen froze in surprise. In his 8 years in intelligence, he'd met people from the tribes who knew individual words, trade terms, curses, commands. But entire phrases with correct sentence structure? Never. The girl's name was Meyer. She was the daughter of a herbalist. She knew the dialects of 6 neighboring tribes. She served as the chieftain's interpreter. Such an education was extremely rare in Zagoria. Meyer said that Chieftain Tarn had sent her, that the old man wanted to know why Kalen had come to Zagoria. It wasn't for water, after all. He'd come without any. Kalen thought. He could have lied. He could have told a tall tale. But he'd been a scout for 8 years and knew one simple rule. In foreign mountains, a lie kills faster than a knife. He told the truth. He said he'd been exiled, that the accusation was false, that Marshal Westmark was preparing a war against the tribes and had removed him because he knew too much. Meyer listened without interrupting. Her face was calm. Her eyes were attentive. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she said she would relay the message to the chief, and she added something of her own. She said that if he was telling the truth, he was the first man from the plains in 40 years to speak the truth on this land. And if he was lying, Chief Tarn would find out. The old man knew how to listen not only to words, but also to what lay between them. She left. Kalen remained sitting by the wall, lost in thought. The map before his eyes didn't fade. He had already grown accustomed to it. It hung there like a second layer of vision, transparent, precise. He could see right through the entire gorge. He could see where cracks ran beneath the rock, where the rock was weak, and where it was strong. He could see an old, collapsed passage in the western wall of the gorge. Long ago, there had been a trail there. Now rocks had blocked it off. But the map showed that the passage behind the debris was intact, and it led to a neighboring gorge. Kalen made a mental note of this. On the 3rd day, Chief Tarn came to him himself. The old man sat down beside him. He was silent for a while. Then he asked through Mir. He asked what Kalen wanted in exchange for the water. Kalen replied that he wanted nothing. Tarn looked at him as if he'd said stones could fly. Nothing comes for free in the hinterlands, water least of all. Kalen explained it differently. He said he needed to walk. He needed to see the land, every stretch of the ridge, every gorge, every trail. And that every time he found water, he would let them know. Because water is not a commodity. Water is what people die without. Tarn was silent for a long time after those words. Then he said a short phrase that Mir translated as follows. The old man said that Kalen was either a saint or a madman, and that in Zagor, those two are often one and the same. Kalen asked the chieftain for permission to explore the area around the camp. Tarn gave him 2 escorts, young warriors, the one with the scar across his eyebrow, whose name was Ort, and his partner, Tim. They walked with Kalen for 3 days, through gorges, up slopes, through old, dry riverbeds. The map unfolded with every step. Every time his foot touched new ground, the layer expanded. He saw more and more. Blue veins of water, yellow dots marking deposits, thin lines of trails, and red flickers. Danger. A mountain cat's lair 3 hours' walk to the east, a rock eagle's nesting site on the northern cliff, and a single red spot that pulsed steadily and insistently to the south. Not a beast, something else. An ambush, or sacred ground. The map didn't say exactly what. It said only one thing. Don't go there. Kalen didn't go. Ort and Tim walked beside him in silence. They didn't speak to him. They didn't look at him. They just walked. But on the 2nd day of their journey together, something happened that shifted the dynamic between them. Kalen stopped at the edge of the cliff. The map showed a short trail below, a goat trail. It cut the journey in half. But next to the trail, a soft red spot flickered. Not bright, not dangerous to humans. A nest. A golden eagle. With chicks. If they took the trail, the eagle would attack. Not the people. The eagle would defend its nest. The chicks might fall out. Kalen looked at the short trail, then at the long detour. He turned around and took the detour. Ort stopped. He looked down. He saw the nest. He looked at Kalen, who was already walking away along the long path. He said nothing. But that evening, by the campfire, Ort offered Kalen a piece of meat for the first time. Silently, without looking him in the eye. By Zagoria standards, it was like a handshake. Kalen took the meat and nodded. Over the course of those 3 days, he had mentally mapped out his first real map of the surrounding area. Not the one he'd seen with his abilities' eyes, but a practical one, grounded in reality. He now knew where the other 2 water sources were. He knew where the copper vein ran close to the surface. He knew 3 goat trails that could be cleared and made passable on foot. And he knew about that collapsed passage in the western wall. On the evening of the 4th day, he went to see Chief Tarn, with Meyer acting as his interpreter. He laid out stones on the ground in front of the old man. Each stone meant something. Here's the campsite. Here's the new well. Here are 2 spots where we can dig some more. Here's the copper. Not deep. About 10 days' work. Enough to make tools for the whole tribe. And here's the old passage in the western wall. If we clear it out, it'll open up a trail to the neighboring gorge. We won't have to take the 2-day detour around the ridge. Tarn listened. He looked at the rocks. Then he looked up. There was something new in his eyes. Not distrust. Trust in the hinterlands is earned over years. But interest. Genuine, lively interest. The old man asked how Kalen knew all this. Kalen answered simply. He said he was a cartographer, that it was his craft, reading the land. Tarn snorted. He said they called it something else. They called it talking to the stone. And that in the old days, people used to get married for doing that. Meyer translated this with a hint of a smile. Kalen wasn't sure if it was a joke. Judging by the chieftain's expression, not quite. Tarn gave the order. In the morning, 20 men began clearing the old passageway in the western wall. Clearing the old passageway took 6 days. The 20 men worked from dawn until dark. Kalen worked alongside them, hauling stones. He broke up the compacted rock with a knife and pickaxes provided by the red clay people. By the 3rd day, his palms had turned into one solid callus. By the 5th, he stopped noticing it. He worked and observed. The map showed weak spots in the rubble, points where removing a single stone would dislodge a dozen others. He showed people where to strike. He didn't explain how he knew, he just pointed. People saw that he was right. The stones fell exactly as he had said. On the 4th day, Ort spoke to him for the first time. He asked if Kalen saw something the others didn't. Kalen paused. Then he replied that he saw the earth a little differently. Ort nodded and asked no more. On the 6th day, the last rock was removed from the passage. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor in the rock, 1.5 meters wide, 5 meters long, and beyond it lay a neighboring gorge, green, with a narrow stream at the bottom. People stood at the entrance and looked on. Some of them had never been to this gorge before. The detour along the ridge used to take 2 days. Now it took 10 steps. Meyer stood next to Kalen. She said quietly that her sister, Leah, had once wanted to see this gorge. She'd said that blue flowers grew there that weren't found on their side. But the journey was too long and dangerous. Leah never made it. Kalen asked what had happened to Leah. Meyer replied in an even voice. 3 years ago, a poisoned well. There was no one else. Leah was the youngest. She was 14. Kalen said nothing. Words were useless here. He simply took it to heart. And that evening, as he sketched a plan on a rock for the future water pipeline from the new well to the campsite, he drew the line a little longer than necessary. A slight curve. The pipeline wouldn't run straight, but would veer toward the gorge where Meyer's family lived. When Meyer asked why he'd laid out the route that way instead of taking a shorter path, he replied that the slope was better there. That was true. But not the whole truth. By the end of his 2nd week with the Red Clays, Kalen had realized one important thing. His map didn't work far away. It only revealed itself where he had walked. Beyond his routes, the map showed a gray mist. Not emptiness. Fog, specifically. As if the land were saying it was there, just waiting for him to come and see. That meant one thing. He needed to walk. Walk a lot. He had to reach every gorge and every pass. And for that, he needed more than just the red clay people. He needed other tribes. Through Meyer, he learned about his neighbors. The closest were the Wind people, a large tribe. About 800 people. They lived on the upper slopes of the mountain range. They herded goats. They were famous for being the best rock climbers in all of Zagoria. And they were famous for their hatred of outsiders. 20 years ago, Westmark soldiers destroyed 3 of their encampments and carried off their people. Ever since then, the Wind people had killed anyone from the plains on the spot. No discussion. No questions. Meyer said that going to the Wind folk was suicide. Kaylin replied that he had to go. Meyer looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would go with him. Because she knew the Wind folk's dialect, and because without an interpreter, they would kill him before he could even open his mouth. Kaylin wanted to object. He didn't want to risk her life. But Meyer said calmly that it wasn't his decision. These were her legs and her voice, and she decided where to take them. He nodded. Chief Tarn gave them 2 escorts to the border of the Red Clay lands. From there on, they traveled alone. The journey to the Windfolk took 3 days. Upward. Upward the whole time. The trails grew narrower. The air grew thinner. At night, the cold crept under his cloak and gnawed at his bones. Kaylin walked, and the map unfolded with every step. New layers, new water veins, new deposits, new trails, and new red flickers of danger. There were more of them here. Mountain cats. Scree. Cracks hidden beneath a thin layer of rock. On the second day, he grabbed Meyer by the elbow. She was already setting her foot on a flat rock ahead. The map showed that this rock hung over a void, a thin slab over a crevasse 10 growths deep. One step, and it would be over. Meyer pulled her foot back. She looked at him. She asked how he knew. Kaylin said he'd seen the crevasse. Meyer looked down. The crevasse wasn't visible. The rock looked solid. She looked at Kaylin again. She didn't say anything, but he could see what she was thinking. Around noon on the third day, they saw smoke. The Wind People's camp was on the crest of the ridge, exposed to all the winds. Stone shelters clung to the cliffs like swallows' nests. Goats roamed the ledges. Kaylin and Meyer hadn't even gotten within 200 paces. The Wind People saw them first. They appeared as if out of the rock. 7 of them. Thin, sinewy people with weather-beaten faces, spears made of mountain ash with bone tips. They moved quickly. They surrounded them in seconds. One of them stepped forward. A woman. Young. Thin and sinewy as a rope. A braid down to her waist. Her face was sharp and inscrutable. She looked at Kaylin and saw his clothes. A Westmark cloak, boots. Her eyes turned to stone. She raised her spear and the tip pressed against Kaylin's chest. Meyer spoke quickly in the dialect of the Windfolk. She identified herself. She named her tribe. She said they had come in peace. The woman with the spear didn't move a muscle. She looked only at Kaylin. Then she uttered a single word. The plains. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Meyer said that Kaylin was an outcast, that Westmark had cast him out, that he was no longer a soldier. The woman listened. The spear didn't move. Then she said she didn't care who had cast him out. She said that 20 years ago, men in boots just like these had come to their encampments and burned everything. They'd taken the women. They'd killed the old people. That ever since then, every person from the plains who set foot on their land received one thing: death. Kaylin stood motionless, the spear pressed against his chest. He could feel the tip piercing through the fabric and scratching his skin. He could have stepped back. He could have raised his hands. Instead, he did one thing. He looked over the woman's shoulder. The map unfolded wide, wider than ever before. He saw the mountain ridge behind the camp. He saw an old landslide. A massive rock avalanche had blocked the gorge half a century ago. And beyond that landslide, he saw a green valley, a gentle slope, grass, a clear stream, a summer pasture, the wind's old pasture, cut off by the landslide so long ago that the younger generation no longer remembered it. Kaylin spoke, quietly and evenly. in their dialect which he knew even less well than the red clay dialect. His words came out haltingly, but the meaning was clear. He said he knew about their old summer pasture, beyond the landslide, where they used to graze goats in the spring. He said the landslide could be bypassed. There was a trail, an old goat trail, along the northern slope, past 3 passes. Long but passable. He could show them the way. The woman froze. Her spear came to a halt. Kaylin saw something flicker across her stony face. She knew about the pasture. She'd heard about it from the elders. But everyone had considered it lost forever. She lowered her spear, not completely, just to her palm. But that was enough. The woman's name was Yuna, the best rock climber among the Wind People, perhaps the best on the entire ridge. She didn't kill Kaylin, but she didn't believe him either. She brought him to the elders of the Wind Tribe and tossed him before them like a sack of stones. 3 old men sat on flat boulders at the entrance to the main shelter. One wind was whipping dust across the ridge. Goats were bleeding somewhere below. The elders looked at Kaylin in silence. Meyer stood nearby and translated every word. Kaylin repeated what he had told Yuna, about the pasture, about the trail, about the landslide that could be bypassed. One of the elders asked how a stranger from the plains knew about their pasture. Kaylin said he could read the land, that it was his craft. The elder snorted. He asked if Kaylin could also see where the bones of their people lay, those killed by Westmark soldiers 20 years ago. Silence. Kaylin felt the air grow heavier. It was a test. Not of knowledge, of conscience. He replied that he didn't see any bones, that his map showed the land. Water, rock, trails, but not people, and not what people had done to one another. And he added that what the Westmark soldiers had done to the Windfolk, he didn't know from a map. He knew from the reports he'd been reading for 8 years, and that he didn't need a map to understand that it was a crime. Silence again. The elders exchanged glances. Then the eldest among them, the one who had asked about the bones, uttered a long phrase. Meyer translated. The old man said that Kaylin's words smelled of truth. But words are like the wind. Let him show them the trail. If the trail is real, they'll talk. If not, his bones will lie alongside theirs. Kaylin nodded. They gave him a guide. Yuna. Kaylin wasn't surprised. This too was a test. Yuna hated people from the plains more than anyone else at the camp. If he cheated, she'd be the first to kill him. They set out at dawn. Meyer stayed at the camp as a guest, or as a hostage. The line was a fine one. Yuna walked ahead, silently. Her back was straight as a spear, her braid fluttered in the wind. She moved across the rocks like a cat. Kaylin could barely keep up. He was a good walker, 8 years of mountain reconnaissance. But Yuna was born on these rocks. She wasn't walking on the mountain, she was part of it. The map guided him. A goat trail wound along the northern slope. Narrow, collapsed in places, but passable. He saw every rock that might give way underfoot, every crevice, every unstable ledge. Yuna noticed how he chose his path, how he placed his foot, how he skirted dangerous spots before they even came into view. She said nothing, but she watched more and more intently. At the pass between the second and third ridges, they stopped. The wind here was so strong that they had to lean forward to stay on their feet. Yuna crouched behind a rock. Kaylin sat down beside her. They were silent. Then Yuna spoke. Not about the trail. She asked why he had gone around the golden eagle's nest. Kaylin didn't understand at first. Then he remembered. That day with Ort, the trail by the cliff. He'd taken the long way around so as not to disturb the bird and its chicks. Yuna said that Ort had told the Red Clay warriors about it, and they'd told the merchant who travels between the tribes, and the merchant had told the Windfolk. Kaylin hadn't known that rumors in the hinterlands travel faster than a man can run. Yuna said her father had been a guide, the best. He walked the trails that others avoided. He died 7 years ago. The goat trail. A fresh rockfall that he didn't notice. Or maybe he did notice it, but decided to go that way anyway because it was faster. She fell silent. Kaylin waited. Yuna said that ever since then, she has hated 2 things. People from the plains, for what they did to her tribe, and the trails, for taking her father away. She said that a person who goes around an eagle's nest is someone who sees a trail differently. Not as a path from point A to point B, but as something alive. Kaelin replied that a trail is indeed alive, that every rock has its own mood and its own character, that if you rush, the mountain feels it and snaps back. Yuna looked at him strangely. Then she said he sounded just like Windwalker, only with a terrible accent. It was the first near joke in all that time. They pressed on. The third pass was the hardest. The trail ran along a ledge above an abyss. It was 2 palms wide. Clouds swirled below. Kaelin pressed himself against the rock and walked sideways. The map showed that the ledge was solid. The rock was sturdy. But his eyes saw the abyss, and his body wouldn't listen to his head. Yuna crossed this section without slowing down. Then she turned around and waited for him on the other side. There was no mockery in her eyes. There was something resembling patience. They reached their destination by noon on the second day. Beyond the last ridge, a valley opened up. A gentle green slope, grass up to their waists, a stream at the bottom. Clear. Kaelin could hear its flow. A blue vein, bright and full. Yuna stopped. Kaelin saw her hands clench into fists. He saw her back straighten even further. She stood there, gazing at a pasture she had never seen. She had only heard about it from the elders, from those who remembered the days before the collapse when used to herd goats across this grass every summer. When the land fed them rather than forcing them to scrape out every scrap. Yuna stood there for a long time. Then she sank to her knees. Not before Kaelin, before the valley. She touched the grass with her palm, crushed it, let go. The grass sprang back up. Yuna stood up. She turned to Kaelin. Her face was still stern, but her eyes were different. She said she would show him the way back. A short one, the kind they only take their own people on. Kaelin understood what that meant. He was no longer a stranger. Not entirely. Not quite. But the first door had opened. The return journey took a day. Yuna led him along trails that weren't on his map, because he hadn't walked them before. Now he had. And the map was unfolding. New layers, new veins. 2 water sources the Windfolk didn't know about. A tin deposit on the northern slope, deep but within reach. 3 old trails that could be restored. When they returned to the camp, the elders were waiting at the entrance. Yuna approached the eldest. She said 2 words. "There's pasture." Silence. Then the old man stood up. He walked over to Kaelin. He looked up at him. He wasn't very tall. He uttered a long phrase. Meyer, who was standing off to the side, translated. The old man said that the Wind people were not on friendly terms with the people of the plains, that this would not change. But this particular man from the plains may walk on their land. He may drink their water. He may sleep by their fire. And if any of the Windfolk raises a hand against him, that person will have to answer to the elders. And it's best not to anger the elders. Kaelin nodded. He accepted. He didn't thank them with words because in Zagoria, verbal thanks are considered a sign of weakness. They show gratitude through deeds, and he already knew what his first deed would be. That evening, he sat down with Meyer and laid out stones on the ground, just as he'd done with the Krasnoglinians. 1 stone marked the Krasnoglinians' encampment, another marked the Vetters' encampment. Between them lay nothing but emptiness, cliffs, precipices, and gorges, a 2-day journey. But the map showed him something else. The map showed a narrow gorge, a red one, with sheer walls and a narrow stream at the bottom. The Red Gorge. If a bridge were built across its narrowest point, the journey between the 2 tribes would be cut down to half a day. 2 peoples who hadn't seen each other in 40 years would be able to cross over to one another without weapons. Because it's not very convenient to cross a bridge with a spear, but with a basket of goods, it's just right. Meyer looked at the stones. Then she looked up. She asked if he understood what he was doing. 2 tribes with different bloodlines, different gods, and 200 years of enmity. A bridge isn't just a bridge. A bridge is a promise. Kaelin nodded. He said he understood, and that a bridge isn't a promise. A bridge is an opportunity. Everyone can make their own promise if they want to. Meyer was silent for a moment. Then she smiled. It was the first time he'd ever seen her smile. The smile was brief, like a ray of sunshine between the clouds and the mountains. She said she would help him speak with both chiefs. Kaelin went to sleep that night, and for the first time in 2 weeks in Zagoria, felt something resembling a sense of direction. Not a plan. He'd been making plans his whole life and knew their worth. A sense of direction. Like a compass needle that had stopped wavering and was pointing north. The map glowed quietly before his closed eyes. 2 little lights, 2 tribes, and between them, an empty space where the bridge would be. He fell asleep with that thought. Negotiations over the bridge took 3 weeks. Kalen shuttled back and forth between the 2 encampments like a shuttle. Up to the wind people, down to the red clay people, up again, down again. His feet grew accustomed to the stone. The skin on his face burned, peeled, and burned again. He lost weight. His cheekbones grew sharp. Meyer said he had come to resemble a man from beyond the mountains. Only his eyes remained foreign, too calm for these mountains. The problem wasn't the bridge. A bridge is stone and wood and hands. The problem was what lay beyond the bridge. The Krasnoglinians and the Windfolk hadn't fought each other in 40 years, but they hadn't spoken either. Between them lay a silence that was worse than enmity. Enmity, at least, is a relationship. Silence is emptiness. Chief Tarn listened to Kalen and shook his head. He said that a bridge is a road, and a road works both ways. Today, merchants walk along it. Tomorrow, warriors. Kalen replied that this was precisely why the bridge had to be narrow. Narrow enough for a man with a basket to pass, but not a column of spearmen. Tarn grunted. He thought. He was silent. Things were more complicated for the Windfolk. The elders didn't trust the Red Clay folk. 30 years ago, the Red Clay folk had diverted a stream that flowed to the Windfolk's camp. They'd channeled it to their own fields. The Windfolk lost their water for an entire summer. 3 children died. The elders remembered those children's names. Kalen listened. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He just listened. Then he asked if the Wind Clan wanted that to happen again. The senior elder looked at him as if he were a stone that had suddenly started to speak. Kalen continued. He said that now both tribes lived separately, each with its own water source, each on its own trails. And if one body of water dries up or one trail collapses, the tribe will be left with nothing. But if there's a bridge, if there's a connection, then when the Wind people's stream dries up, they go to the Red Clay people. And when the Red Clay people's trail collapses, they go to the Wind people. Not as supplicants, like neighbors who share a common road. The elder was silent for a long time. Then he asked who would build the bridge. Kalen said both sides would. 10 people from each tribe, to work together, to eat together, to sleep by the same campfire. Because a bridge isn't built by hands alone. A bridge is built by people who have learned to stand side by side. Una was present at these negotiations. She stood by the wall and said nothing. But after the elders left to consult, she approached Kalen. She told him that he spoke beautifully, but that building a bridge across the Red Gorge was madness. The walls were sheer. The bottom is 100 growths below. The rock is brittle. One wrong blow and the whole wall will come crashing down. Kalen nodded. He said that was exactly why he needed the best rock climber on the entire ridge. Una looked at him. She understood. She snorted. She said that didn't mean she trusted him. Just that she wouldn't let some outsider from the plains kill 20 people because he didn't know how to read the rock. Kalen accepted that. 3 days later, the elders gave their consent. Tarn gave his consent the following day. 20 people gathered at the Red Gorge at dawn on the 4th 30th month since Kalen's exile. 10 Red Clay, 10 Wind. They stood in 2 groups 10 paces apart and did not look at one another. Kalen stood between them. The map unfolded before his eyes. The gorge was deep and narrow. The redstone walls dropped 100 roasts. At the bottom, a thin stream. The gorge was about 15 paces wide at its narrowest point. The map showed the structure of the walls, where the rock was solid, where it was layered, where there were cracks, where a support could be driven in and would hold the weight of 100 people, and where one must not touch it, because the wall had a life of its own and was just waiting for an excuse to crumble. Kalen started with the simplest task. He took a piece of red clay and sketched a plan for the bridge on a flat rock. Una stood nearby and watched. Then she poked her finger at one of the support points. She said the rock there was bad, that she knew this wall. She'd walked along it 3 times. The rock there was layered. It breaks away in layers. Kalen looked at the map. Una was right. He moved the point 2 steps to the left. Una nodded. It was the first time they'd worked together, not just side by side, but together. The construction took 26 days. 26 days on the edge of the abyss. Yuna rappelled down the wall on ropes and marked the points for the supports. Kaelin stood at the top and read the map. The red clay people hewed the stone. The wind folk spun ropes from goat's wool. By the end of the first week, the two groups still weren't talking to each other. They ate separately. They slept separately. On the 8th day, something happened that broke the ice. One of the red clay men, a guy named Dim, slipped at the edge of the gorge. His foot slipped on the wet rock, and he hung by his hands over the abyss. His fingers were slipping. He didn't scream. In Zagorya, men don't scream when they fall. They stay silent and hold on. Standing closest to him was a wind man named Kai, a young goat herder with long arms. He didn't think. He just stepped forward and grabbed Dim by the wrist. He pulled him up in one swift motion. They both lay on the edge, breathing heavily. Then Dim sat up. He looked at Kai. Kai looked at Dim. Not a word. But that evening, they sat down by the same campfire. Others joined them. By the end of the second week, the two camps had become one. Mire, who came every 3 days with food from the Krasnogliny settlement, was the first to notice it. She told Kaelin that he wasn't building a bridge. He was building something else. Kaelin replied that he was building a bridge. Mire shook her head and smiled. On the 26th day, the last stone was set in place. The bridge was narrow, 2 steps wide and 15 steps long. The stone supports extended into the gorge wall to a depth of 3 heights. The railing, made of mountain wood, reached waist high. Kaelin had deliberately made the bridge flat, without steps, so that the elderly could cross it, so that children could cross it, and so that women carrying heavy baskets could cross it. Chief Tarn was the first to cross the bridge. The old man stepped onto a stone. He looked down. 100 heights to the bottom of the gorge. The wind whistled through the crevices. Tarn walked all 15 paces without stopping. On the other side, he was met by the senior elder of the Wind Clan. The 2 old men stood facing each other. 40 years of silence lay between them. Tarn extended his hand. The Wind Clan elder looked at that hand. Then he took it. Kaelin stood in the middle of the bridge. The wind ruffled his cloak. He watched the 2 old men shaking hands on his bridge. And he thought about how, 4 months ago, he had stood on the pass with an empty flask and the closed gates behind him. And now he stood on the bridge between 2 peoples. Meyer stood beside him. Yuna was at the other end. Both were silent. But Kaelin felt that this silence was different. Not empty. Full. The 5th month brought rain. A rare for Zagori. Water fell from the sky for 3 days, and the mountains were transformed. Dry riverbeds came to life. Cracks in the rocks swelled with moisture. The red clay darkened to a brownish hue. The map before Kaelin's eyes flashed with dozens of new blue veins. Temporary streams, seasonal flows, water that would retreat back beneath the rock in a week. But while it was here, he could memorize where it flowed, where it went, where it gathered in underground pockets. Kaelin walked in the rain from dawn to dusk. He was soaked to the bone. He caught a cold. He coughed for 3 days. Meyer brought him a decoction made from bitter roots. He took a sip and grimaced. Meyer said that her mother, the herbalist, used to say that if the medicine tasted good, it didn't work. Kaelin drank it all down to the last drop. By the 6th month, he knew the surroundings of the 2 tribes like the back of his hand. The map covered a territory 3 days' journey in every direction. Every rock, every trail, every water vein. But that wasn't enough. Further north lay the lands of the Salt people. To the east, the lands of the Moon people. And between them and the rest of the hinterlands lay a scattering of small tribes, each sitting on its own little patch of land and snarling at its neighbors. Kaelin understood that he couldn't go to everyone at once. He had to choose his next move, and the move chose him. A merchant arrived at the Red Clay people's camp. A wandering money changer from the small tribe of the Red Foxes. A skinny man with shrewd eyes and a sack full of salt. He brought news. The Salt people were enduring the worst year in living memory. Their main salt flat had been flooded by the spring runoff. The salt had been washed away. Supplies were running out. And without salt in Zagorja, you can't preserve meat. You can't tan hides. You can't treat wounds. Salt here isn't just a seasoning. Salt is life. But there was a second piece of news. Worse than the first. The Salt people's children were sick. A cold winter, damp shelters, a cough that wouldn't go away for months. The girls were freezing in stone caves where the wind blew freely. Some didn't make it through the spring. Kalen listened to the merchant and felt the map pulsing behind his eyes. As if the earth, too, could hear and wanted to answer. He knew where a copper vein lay at the border of the 3 tribes. Not deep. 10 days' work. Copper means tools. Copper means trade. But right now, the salt people don't need copper. They need work that keeps them warm, a roof over their heads, an occupation that feeds and warms them, a mine. An underground mine where the temperature remains constant all year round, where they can work in the warmth, where children can sit at the entrance and warm themselves with the air rising from below. He unfolded the map wider. He searched. He found it. 2 days' journey to the northeast, at the junction of the red claylands and the territory the salt people considered their own, lay more than just copper. Deeper, at the edge of his map's reach, a yellow dot of tin glimmered, and next to it, a thin gray line. Coal, the black stone that burns. Combine copper and tin and you get bronze. Add coal and you have heat for smelting and for life. An entire industrial hub beneath a single mountain. Kalen went to see Chief Tarn. He laid out the stones. He explained. Tarn listened. When Kalen said that the mine should be shared, that people from the Red Clay, the Wind, and the Salt clans would work there together, Tarn was silent for a long time. Then he asked why. Why let outsiders near the ore that lay on his land? Kalen answered with a single sentence. He said that the Red Clay people numbered 400. 400 people couldn't handle a mine of that size, but 1,000 could. And there would be enough ore for everyone, because the vein was large. Tarn thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he said he agreed, but on one condition. The first copper would go to the Krasno-Glinianese forge. Kalen said that the first copper would go to the Solyanis, because the Solyanis girls were dying of coughs, and they needed warm indoor work sooner than anyone else. Tarn looked at him. For a long time. Then he nodded. He didn't argue. There was something about Kalen's face when he spoke of the children that made one not want to argue. Kalen made his way to the salt people with Mir and Yuna. Yuna volunteered herself. She said she needed to stretch her legs. In reality, she didn't want to leave Kalen without someone who knew how to navigate the cliffs. The salt people lived in a wide valley with gently sloping walls. There was more land here than among the mountain tribes. But this land was salty and barren. Grass grew in tufts. There were almost no trees. The encampment looked poor. Shelters made of flat stones stacked without mortar. Cracks in the walls were plugged with animal hides. The wind blew right through them. Kalen saw children. They were thin, with dark circles under their eyes. Coughing could be heard from every other shelter. He felt a chill inside. Not because of the wind. The chief of the salt people was a woman. A large woman. With heavy hands and a heavy gaze. Her name was Gara. She met Kalen unarmed. Rumors of the man who could hear water had already reached this place. Merchants worked faster than any messenger. Gara listened to him, her face expressionless. When he finished, she asked one question. What he wanted from the salt people. Kalen said he wanted the salt people to send 20 men to the communal mine to work alongside the red clay people and the wind people. In return, the first copper from the mine would place to the salt people. No strings attached, no debt. Gara was silent. Then she said that the salt people had never, in their entire lives, worked alongside people from other tribes. That it was against custom, against their pride, against the memory of their ancestors. Kalen replied quietly. He said that the memory of the ancestors was important, but children were more important, and that if the ancestors could see the girls dying of coughs in the cold caves, they would agree with him. Gara looked at him. Then she turned away. Kalen saw her shoulders tremble, just for a moment. She turned back, her face as hard as stone, and said she would send people. 20, in 5 days. Kalen nodded. As he was leaving, he stopped at one of the shelters. Inside sat a girl of about 7, wrapped in a pelt, coughing. Standing nearby was a woman with a haggard face, her mother. Kalen looked at the map. Near the Salt Valley, at a depth of 4 man-heights, ran a hot vein. Not water, not ore. Heat, hot stone. Somewhere deep beneath their feet, the earth was warming up. If they dug a vertical shaft and channeled air through it, they could heat the shelters. He made a mental note. He returned to Gara. He pointed out the spot. He said that if they dug here, they'd find warm rock, and that the heat could be channeled into the shelters. Gara asked how he knew. Kalen said the earth had told him. Gara looked at him the way Tarn had once looked at him, as if he were a rock that hadn't been there before. Then she nodded and sent people to dig. On the way back, Yuna walked beside him, saying nothing. Then she said one thing. She said that when Kalen spoke of the girls dying from coughs, his voice had changed. It had grown lower, quieter, like a man speaking not of other people's children, but of his own. Kalen didn't answer. He was thinking about the mine, about how, in a week, people from 3 tribes who had never worked together would gather in one place, and that it would be harder than building a bridge. Work on the mine began at dawn on the 6th month. 60 men, 20 red clay, 20 wind, 20 salt. 3 groups, 3 languages, 3 sets of customs, 3 sets of grievances. Kalen stood at the entrance to the future tunnel and watched the men. The red clay had huddled together on the right. The wind people were on the left. The salt people were in the middle but slightly set apart from both. No one was speaking. Kalen knew that the next few minutes would determine everything. If he started with a speech, they wouldn't listen to him. In Zagorja, speeches are given by chiefs. He wasn't a chief. He was an outsider who could hear the water. So he didn't speak. He picked up the pickaxe, a heavy bone pickaxe given to him by the red clay people. He walked up to the wall. The map showed the entrance point. Here the rock was soft for 3 heights deep. Further in, it would get harder, but the ore was within arm's reach. He struck the first blow. The rock cracked. Shards flew off. He struck a second time, a third. He worked in silence, methodically, just as he had worked for 8 years in reconnaissance when he had to cut a passage through a pile of debris. A minute later, Ort stood down beside him. The red clay warrior with a scar across his eyebrow picked up his pickaxe and began striking beside him, silently. Another minute later, Kai approached, the wind goat herd who had saved Dima on the bridge. He stood on the other side, then Salt, then another. 5 minutes later, 12 men stood in a row, striking the rock, without a command, without a word, simply because someone had started and the others didn't want to just stand there. Kalen stepped back. He wiped the sweat from his brow. He looked at the workers. The red clay, wind, and salt warriors stood intermingled, shoulder to shoulder. No one chose a spot based on their tribe. They stood wherever there was room. He felt something shift, a small shift, but real. Meyer came over and handed him some water. He drank. She said there was blood on his hands. His calluses had burst. Kalen looked at his palms. It was true. He hadn't noticed. Meyer bandaged his hands with strips of cloth. Her fingers were quick and precise. She didn't look him in the eye while she was bandaging him. She looked at his hands. Kalen looked at the top of her head. 4 braids. A red thread was woven into each, as was the custom for unmarried women. He looked away. Work in the mine had been going on for 10 days. Kalen was leading, not commanding. Leading, showing where to strike, where to reinforce the walls with logs, where to stop because the rock was unstable. The map worked underground only to a depth of 20 paces. Any deeper and he was blind. That was frightening. He was used to seeing, used to knowing what lay ahead. But here, in the darkness of the tunnel, the map faded, and he was just an ordinary man with a pickaxe. Yuna noticed this. She came to the mine every 2 days. She checked the supports. She inspected the walls for cracks. On the 3rd day, she told Kalen that he was acting strangely when he went deep into the tunnel. She said he seemed tense. He was clenching his jaw, like someone who'd lost something important and was trying not to show it. Kalen replied briefly. He said his vision was worse underground. Yuna nodded. She didn't press him for details, but from that day on, she went down into the deepest sections herself. She checked the rock with her hands. She tapped the walls. She listened to how the rock responded to the impact. She did what her father had done. She read the rock without any map, just by experience and by ear. Kalen saw this and silently acknowledged it. His ability was more powerful, but Yuna's craft was older, and in some ways, more reliable. On the 10th day, one of the salt people's pickaxes struck soft rock. A greenish stone, copper ore. The people stopped. They stared at the green gleam in the torchlight. The silence in the tunnel was complete. Then one of the red clay people whistled, and everyone shouted, all together. The red clay, the wind, and the salt people. They shouted and patted each other on the backs. Kellen stood by the wall and watched. 3 weeks ago, these people couldn't even stand next to one another. Now they were hugging each other. The first ore was brought to the surface in leather sacks. Kellen personally carried 3 sacks to Gara. The Salt Clan chief took the ore. She looked at the greenish chunks. Then she looked at Kellen. She said nothing. But at dinner that evening at the Salt People's camp, Kalen was given a seat by the main fire for the first time, next to the chieftain. That meant more than any words could. Now they needed a blacksmith, someone who could turn the raw ore into tools, into arrowheads, into cauldrons, into knives. Kalen knew who he needed. Merchants had spoken of the Salt People's blacksmith, the only female blacksmith in the entire mountain range, the best in all of Zagorja, but one who worked with scraps of ore because her tribe wouldn't give her proper materials. Her name was Rhea. He found her forge at the edge of the camp. A low stone shelter, a small kiln made of fired clay, an anvil carved from a single piece of granite. The tools were rough but well-maintained, each in its place, order amid chaos. Rhea stood by the kiln, tall, broad-shouldered, her forearms marked by old burns. Her hands were heavy and skilled. She turned around when Kalen entered. She sized him up, looking up at him and then down at him. He was half a head shorter than her. She asked in a low voice what he wanted. Kalen placed a piece of copper ore in front of her. The greenish stone landed on the anvil. Rhea looked at the ore, then at Kalen. He said the ore was from a new mine, a mine shared by the 3 tribes. He explained that, according to the agreement, the first copper was to go to the Salt People, and that he wanted her to smelt this copper. Rhea didn't answer right away. She picked up the ore. She turned it over in her hands, held it up to the light, then clenched it in her fist so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Kalen saw her turn away, quickly, for just a moment. Her shoulders trembled. She turned back, her face set like stone. Her eyes were dry, but something burned in them. She said she needed a bigger furnace. And coal. Good coal, not the goat dung she'd been using to fuel the furnace for the past 3 years. Kalen replied that there would be coal. Black stone from the same mountain. In a week. Ray nodded. Then she looked at his bandaged hands. She asked how long it had been since he'd had a proper meal. Kalen couldn't remember. Ray snorted. She sat him down on a rock by the forge. From behind the anvil, she pulled out a piece of goat cheese wrapped in a hide and a flatbread. She shoved them into his hands. She said that working without food wasn't work, it was suicide. Kalen ate. The cheese was salty and tangy. The flatbread was hard. It was the best meal of his life. Ray stood nearby, looking at the copper ore in her fist. And she smiled. Broadly. Like someone who had just gotten back something stolen from them long ago. The 7th month began with bad news. A merchant from the Red Fox tribe brought rumors from the southern passes. 6 men in gray cloaks had crossed Wolf Pass a week ago. They moved silently. No banners. No supply train. Traveling light. 6 means not an army. 6 means reconnaissance. Kalen knew who they were. The Gray Rangers, his former comrades. The elite scouts of the 2nd Border Corps. The best mountain travelers in all of the Westmark. Some of them were his own students. People he himself had taught to read tracks and navigate the ridges. Marshal Holbrook didn't wait. He sent out a silent reconnaissance party to find out what was happening beyond the mountains, to find Kalen, to assess the situation, and if possible, to settle the matter quietly. A knife between the shoulder blades on a dark trail. No one would ever know. Kalen gathered Meyer and Una. He told them what was happening. Una immediately suggested an ambush. She said she knew the passes the strangers would take. 3 narrow passages. 6 people at each. The problem would be solved before sunset. Kalen shook his head. He said he wouldn't kill his former men. Una looked at him with an expression he'd already learned to read. It was the look she gave when she thought he was crazy, but didn't want to say it out loud. Meyer asked what he was going to do. Kalen replied that he would meet them, in person, and show them what they'd come to see, the truth. He set out alone. The map showed 6 red dots to the south. They flickered softly. Danger, but not fatal. The map sensed the difference between a predator hunting and a predator scouting. These 6 were still scouting. Kalen walked south for 2 days, along his well-trodden trails, past places he knew by heart, past the Red Clay people's new well, past the entrance to the mine where Rhea's furnace smoldered, past the bridge over the Red Gorge. He walked and thought about the fact that he was about to see people he had known for years. People with whom he had shared bread and fire and silence on the cold mountain passes. People who had been ordered to kill him. On the third day he found them, or rather, he let them find him. He sat down in an open spot on a flat rock in the middle of a goat trail. He took off his cloak and laid his knife beside him, the hilt facing them. Then he waited. They appeared an hour later, 6 of them. Gray cloaks, hoods. Their movements were quiet and precise. Professionals. He recognized 3 of them. Bran, a broad-shouldered tracker with a red beard. They'd traversed the northern mountain passes together for 3 years. Tim Malley, a young guy who'd joined the Corps as a greenhorn and 2 years later had become the squad's best marksman. Kaelin had taught him to read the wind. And Daria Rowe. She brought up the rear. Composure. Precision. Her face was like a mask, cold and impassive. She had changed over these past months. She'd lost weight, dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was cut short. It used to be shoulder length. She was the first to see him. She stopped. The others stopped behind her. Silence. The wind. 6 pairs of eyes fixed on a single man sitting with a knife at his feet. Bran was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He said they had orders. Kaelin nodded. He said he knew what the orders were. He stood up. Slowly. No sudden movements. He left the knife on the rock. He said he wouldn't fight them. That wasn't why he'd been waiting for them. He'd come to show them something. Bran exchanged glances with the others. Daria remained silent. Her face was still like a mask. Kaelin turned his back on them. It was a deliberate decision. He exposed his back to the 6 armed men who had come to kill him. He set off down the trail. After a few steps, he heard footsteps behind him. All 6 were following. He led them for 3 hours, in silence, along the trails he himself had blazed. He showed them the Krasnogliniani well, clean water from beneath the dry riverbed. He showed them the cleared passage in the western wall, 10 steps instead of a 2-day journey. He showed them the bridge across the Red Gorge, 2 tribes walking toward each other without weapons. He showed them the mine, people from 3 tribes working shoulder to shoulder. Rhea's forge, where the first copper tools were forged from raw ore. He showed them the water channel leading to the Krasnogliniani encampment, the very same one, with a slight bend that they named after Mir's sister. He didn't explain. He didn't try to persuade them. He simply showed them, silently, like pointing out a map. This is here. That is there. See for yourselves. By evening, they were standing at the edge of the Red Gorge, a stream below, the bridge behind them. The sunset painted the rocks gold and copper. Bran sat on a rock and said nothing. His face was heavy. Tim the younger stood at the edge and looked down. The other 3 had gathered off to the side and were talking quietly. Daria stood apart from everyone else. She was looking at the bridge. Kaelin walked over to her. He stood beside her. They were silent. Then Daria spoke. Her voice was soft. She said that evening at the tribunal, she had wanted to stand up. She had wanted to speak. But she couldn't. Kaelin replied that he knew. Daria said she'd been carrying this inside her for 3 years. That she woke up with it every morning. That it was like a nail in her chest that couldn't be pulled out. Kaelin didn't respond to that. Words were of no help here. He knew that from experience. There are things that cannot be forgiven with words. They can only be forgiven through action. But the time for action hadn't come yet. He said something else. He asked what she had seen today. Daria paused. She said she had seen something she hadn't expected. She had seen people building instead of fighting. She had seen water that no one was taking away. She had seen a bridge that people crossed without weapons. And she saw Kaelin, the man she was supposed to kill. The man who roams the mountains without a knife. Kaelin said that in 6 months, Marshal Holbrook would send an army. Not 6 men, thousands. And that then everything she'd seen today would turn to ashes. If only. He fell silent. Daria turned to him. If only what? Kaelin said he needed people who knew how the Marshal thought. How the army moved. which mountain passes it would choose, how much provisions it had for a mountain campaign. He needed scouts, his former scouts. Not all of them, just those who were willing. Daria was silent for a long time. The sunset was fading. Shadows fell across the rocks. She said she couldn't decide for others, but she could decide for herself, and that she needed the night. In the morning, Bran and Tim the Younger approached Kaelin. Bran said they were staying. Tim nodded. The other three stood aside. One of them said he would leave, that he had a family in the Westmark, a wife and a daughter. He couldn't do it. The other two said the same thing. Families, duty, fear. Kaelin nodded. He walked over to them. He said he held no ill will toward them, that they would leave in peace. He asked for one thing. When they returned to the marshal, let them not report what they'd been ordered to say. Let them tell what they'd seen. The three left, in silence, without looking back. Just like that convoy at Wolf Pass 7 months ago. Only this time, Kaelin watched their backs without bitterness. Daria stayed behind. She stood off to the side. When the three had disappeared over the ridge, she approached Kaelin. She said one word. "I'm staying." Kaelin nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't embrace her. He didn't say, "I forgive you," out loud. He just nodded. That was enough. For now. The 8th month. Rumors spread across the mountain range faster than the wind. Kaelin knew that the 3 returning rangers would report to the marshal. And he knew that Holbrook would hear not the truth, but what he needed to hear. He would hear that the outcast row was uniting the tribes. He would hear the word the marshal had been waiting for. A threat. A pretext. But the army was still a long way off. Winter. The mountain passes would be closed by snow in 2 months. No one would lead 10,000 spears through the Grey Fangs in winter. Kaelin had time. Not much, but he had some. He spent it on the Moon People. The Moon tribe lived in the eastern foothills, farther than anyone else from the passes leading to Westmark. A quiet, strange tribe. About 300 people. They didn't fight. They didn't trade. They had almost no contact with their neighbors. They lived around their temple, a round stone structure open to the sky. And they read the stars. The Moon People believed that the earth and the sky were one map, that the stars above reflect the stones below, that if you read the sky correctly, you can see what is hidden beneath the earth. When Meyer told him this, Kaelin stopped. He asked her to repeat it. Meyer repeated it. Kaelin was silent for a long time. Then he said he needed to go to the Moon People, urgently. The journey took 4 days. Kaelin walked with Meyer. Una stayed behind to watch over the mine. Daria and Bran began surveying the mountain passes and marking out defensive positions. They worked quietly and quickly. Professionals. For the first time in 7 months, Kaelin was heading not west or north, but east. The map unfolded with every step. New land, new layers. It was different here than among the Red Clay or the Windfolk. The rock was different. Light-colored, almost white. Limestone. Caves. Underground cavities. Here, water didn't flow in veins but in lakes. Huge lenses of clear water beneath the rock. The map showed them as blue clouds. And one more thing, the layer of memory. That very strange layer that had revealed itself in the 6th month. Here it was brighter than anywhere else. Old foundations, buried passages, stones that someone had hewn hundreds of years ago. The earth here remembered more, as if something ancient and important had once lived in these mountains, and traces of it were visible through the rock like a pattern on an old blade. The Moon People's settlement didn't look like a settlement. It looked like a small town. Houses made of white stone, neat, with flat roofs. The streets were paved with slabs, clean, quiet. People in light-colored clothes moved slowly and spoke softly. The temple stood in the center, a circle of tall white stones, no roof. The sky above it was like a dome. A priestess greeted Kaelin, an old woman with white hair and surprisingly youthful eyes. She looked at him, at his calloused hands, at his dust-covered cloak, at the bone amulet of Tarn around his neck. And she said in pure Westmark that she had been waiting for him. Kaelin wasn't surprised. It's hard to surprise a scout. But something stirred inside him. The priestess said that the stars had foretold his coming 3 months ago. A man who walks the earth, and the earth opens up to him. She said it was an ancient gift, that in the past, the priests of all the tribes had seen it together. Long ago, when the tribes were one people. Kaylin asked what she meant. The priestess smiled. She said that answers aren't given right away here, but that there was someone he should speak with. They brought her to him that evening. 19 years old. Slender. Light hair down to her waist. Quiet. She entered and, before speaking, closed her eyes for 10 seconds. Kaylin waited. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him. And he saw what she was seeing. Not his face. Not his clothes. Something else. Something behind him or within him. Her name was Sona. A young priestess of the Moon tribe. She read the stars. She knew the ancient symbols. And she sensed what others did not. Sona said quietly that a map was glowing around him, that she saw it as thin lines in the air. Kaylin froze. No one had ever seen his map. He thought it was meant only for his eyes. Sona said she wasn't seeing the map itself, but its trail, like the glow around a burning torch. She couldn't see the details, but she could see that the map existed, and she could see that it was alive. Not a lifeless tool, alive. Kaylin asked what that meant. Sona closed her eyes again. 10 seconds. She opened them. She said she didn't know for sure, but that the old records in the temple spoke of a gift that the earth bestowed upon those who knew how to listen, and that this gift always came with something else, with a voice. Kaylin asked, "What kind of voice?" Sona looked at him intently. She asked if he heard anything at night, in his sleep. Kaylin wanted to say no, but he stopped himself. Because last night, during a rest stop in a cave on the way to the Moon people, he'd had a dream. In that dream, he was standing on the edge of a vast void, dark and warm, and a sound was coming from that void. Not words, not a voice, a hum, low and steady, as if a mountain were breathing. He woke up with the sensation that someone had placed a hand on his chest, a warm, heavy hand. He told Sona about it. She listened without moving. Then she said that in the old records, this is called the first touch. The earth had found the one it was looking for, and it began to speak. Kaylin asked who was speaking. Sona shook her head. She said the answer lay deeper than she could see. But if he wanted to know, he'd have to go further. The map would reveal more as he made more connections. They talked until dawn. Sona told him about the old days, about how all the tribes had once been one people, how they built roads together, dug wells together, and stood together in the White Temple, reading the sky. And then they fell out. Over water. Over salt. Over pride. They shattered into 40 fragments and forgot they had once been whole. Kaylin listened and felt the map pulsing behind his eyes, steady and warm, like a heartbeat, or like the breath of something vast and sleeping. In the morning, he asked the old priestess for permission to explore the surroundings. The priestess gave him a guide. Sona. Kaylin didn't ask why her specifically. He knew. They walked for 3 days. Sona moved quietly, almost silently. She spoke little, but when she did, every word hit the mark. On the second day, she stopped by a flat rock on the hillside. She placed her palm on the rock. She said there was something old down here. Kaylin looked at the map. A layer of memory. Beneath the rock, a foundation. Old. Very old. Hundreds of years old. And lines radiating from it in all directions. Like rays from a star. Old roads. Buried. Forgotten. But visible on the map. He told Sonia he saw the same thing. She nodded. For the first time in 3 days, she smiled, subtly and briefly. She said it was good. That she'd felt lonely seeing what others couldn't see. Kaylin understood that. More deeply than he'd care to admit. Because he'd known the loneliness of the sighted among the blind for 8 years. The maps he'd drawn in Westmark were the best. But no one understood what they meant. To the generals, they were just lines on paper. To him, it was the land. Alive. Speaking. And now there was a man standing beside him who could hear it too. In a different way. Through the stars, not through stone. But he heard. Upon returning to the Moon People's encampment, Kaylin gathered Meyer and Sona together. He laid out the stones on the white slab by the temple. He showed them the map. 4 tribes: the red clay people, the wind people, the salt people, the moon people, the bridge, the mine, waterways, and further to the north and west, another 36 tribes he hadn't seen or known about. But they needed to be united. By spring, before Holbrook led his army across the mountain passes, he needed council. A general council of chiefs, a place where everyone would sit together and look at a single map, and see not just their own patches of land, but the whole picture. Meyer said it was impossible, that some tribes hadn't sat together since the days of their great-grandfathers, that there was a blood feud dating back 200 years. Kalen said he knew, and that was precisely why the council must meet by the water, on neutral ground, at a spring that belongs to everyone and no one. He'd already seen such a place on the map, the confluence of 2 underground rivers, at the junction of 6 tribal territories, no man's land, a sacred place that everyone bypasses and no one touches. If they dug a well there and named it Common, they could gather the council around that well. Sona said quietly that this place was called the Heart of Water on the old maps, that a temple of the United Tribes once stood there, long ago, before the schism. Kalen looked at her, then at the map. His memory confirmed it. The foundation, an old circle of stones, buried, but intact. He said the council would gather at the Heart of Water, in 2 months, by the start of winter, and that in those 2 months, he needed to cover every inch of land between the 4 tribes on foot and reach at least 8 new ones. Meyer looked at him. She asked if he understood that 2 months was very little time. Kalen replied that he did. And that was exactly why he needed not 1 interpreter, but 2. Meyer and Sona. Meyer for the words, Sona for what lies beyond the words. Sona closed her eyes for 10 seconds. She opened them. She said she would go. That all her life she'd been told a priestess must remain at the temple, not to go beyond the pass, to serve the stars, not the roads, but that the stars shine not only over the temple, they shine over the entire mountain range. And if the earth calls her to go, then she'll go. The old priestess stood at the temple entrance and listened. When Sona fell silent, the old woman nodded. She neither approved nor forbade it. She simply nodded, like someone who knew it would happen this way. Kalen stood up. He had 2 months, among 7 tribes, 1 impossible gathering, and a map that hummed in his dreams. For 2 months, Kalen hadn't stopped. He walked from tribe to tribe. His feet were worn down to the flesh. His Westmark boots fell apart in the 3rd week. Rhea sewed him some mountain boots out of goatskin with soles made of thick oxhide. He put them on and felt that the earth was closer. The soles were thinner. He could feel the stones with every step. The map resonated more vividly. Meyer walked on his right, Sona on his left. 3 people, 3 languages, 3 ways of seeing the world. Meyer saw through words. She'd walk into a camp, and within an hour she'd know who was feuding with whom and who owed whom a goat from last fall. Sona saw through silence. She'd close her eyes for 10 seconds, then open them and say that the chief was afraid, or that the elder was lying, or that the young warrior at the entrance was in love with a girl from a neighboring tribe and would therefore vote for an alliance. Kalen saw the earth, and the 3 of them saw everything. First came the Greystones tribe, small, 120 people. They lived in caves on the northern slope, destitute, without ore, without decent water, with only a half-forgotten goat trail leading to their nearest neighbors. Kalen found water for them in half a day. A spring beneath a rocky scree 200 paces from the caves. They dug for 2 days. The water started flowing, clean, cold. The chief of the Greystones, an old man with trembling hands, looked at the water and wept. He didn't try to hide it. His people stood around him in silence. Then the old man wiped his face and asked what Kalen wanted. Kalen said he wanted the chief to come to the Heart of Water in 2 months and sit alongside the other chiefs. The old man asked which others. Kalen listed them: the red clay, the wind, the salt, and the moon. The old man flinched at each name, but he nodded. The second tribe, the fire people, 300 people. They lived near an extinct volcano. They worked with obsidian, making knives and arrowheads from it. the finest blades in the backlands, proud, reserved. The chief was a young man with black eyes and scars from obsidian shards on his hands. He didn't want to listen to a stranger. Kalen didn't mention water. There was plenty of water here, hot springs by the volcano. He pointed out something else. The map revealed a vein of silver beneath the mountain, thin but pure. In Zagorja, silver was valued above all else except water. The chief looked at the spot Kalen had indicated. He looked at his scarred hands. Then he asked what the price was. Kalen said the price was a seat on the council. The chief thought about it for 3 days. Then he agreed. The third tribe, the river people. The fourth, the stone owls. The fifth, the bitter grasses. The sixth, the white clays. For each, Kalen found what was missing: water, ore, a trail, a forgotten pasture, a lost passage to a neighboring gorge. The map unfolded with every step, and each new tribe added a piece to it. The gray mist receded. The land opened up. At the seventh tribe, what Kalen had both expected and feared happened. They reached the border of the Bone tribe's lands. The map glowed red, brightly. Not a gentle warning, but a stark signal. An ambush. 10 warriors, 300 steps ahead. Behind a rock at the bend in the trail, Kalen stopped. Meyer and Sona stood behind him. He said quietly that there were people ahead, armed, waiting. Meyer asked how many. Kalen said 10. Meyer turned pale. Sona closed her eyes. 10 seconds. She opened them. She said she sensed anger. A heavy, old anger, not a new one. Kalen thought quickly. They could go around them. The map showed a trail across the southern ridge. Long, but safe. But if they went around, the Bone people would know he was afraid, and then they'd never come to the council. He started forward. Meyer grabbed his hand. He turned around, looked at her, told her and Sona to wait there. If he didn't return in an hour, they should go to the Red Clay people. Meyer didn't let go of his hand. She said she would go with him, that without an interpreter, they'd kill him without a word. Kalen looked at her hand resting on his. Her fingers were slender, strong. They weren't trembling. He nodded. The two of them set off together. Sona stayed behind. The ambush struck exactly where the map had indicated. 10 warriors. Bone armor made of horn and bone plates. Their faces painted with white clay. Skulls on their belts. Not human. Goat skulls. But they made an impression. Spears were thrust into Kalen's chest from all sides. He stood motionless. Meyer was beside him. Pale, but her voice was steady. She spoke in the language of the Bone people. A girl stepped out from behind the warriors' backs. Slender, sharp features. A tattoo in the form of a thin line across her cheek. A mark of a warrior clan. She looked at Kalen. Her eyes were cold, intelligent, dangerous. Meyer introduced her. Hana, the daughter of the Bone tribe's chieftain. Hana said through Meyer that her father had sent her to find out what kind of worm was crawling through the backlands and messing with people's minds. Kalen replied that he wasn't a worm. He was a cartographer. Hana said it didn't matter to her what he called himself, that her father considers him a sorcerer, a demon from the plains who bewitches the tribes, and that her father sent her to kill him if the opportunity arose. Kalen asked why she hadn't killed him yet. Hana looked at him for a long time. Then she said she wanted to see first exactly what he does, with her own eyes. Before deciding whether to believe her father, Kalen nodded. He said he'd show her, just as he'd shown the hunters. Hana smirked, subtly and venomously. She said he was confident for a man with 10 spears in his chest. Kalen replied that he wasn't confident in himself, in the earth. The earth doesn't lie. Hana gestured to have the spears removed. They walked together. Kalen pointed things out. Hana watched. She said nothing. Her face was like a mask, not a single emotion. 3 days. The well, the bridge, the mine. Gorn Ray, the red clay settlement, where the children now ran, not thin but simply scrawny. The difference is subtle, but it's there. Hana saw everything and said nothing. On the 4th day, she said she would return to her father and that she would report. Kalen asked what she would report. Hana looked at him. She said she would report the truth, but whether her father would believe it was another matter. She left. 10 warriors followed her. Kalen watched them go. Meyer stood beside him. She said quietly that Hana hadn't killed him, not because she wanted to see him, but because she had doubts about her father. Kalen nodded. He understood that too. He had brought the 8th tribe into the alliance 2 days ahead of schedule, the small Riverbirds tribe. 200 people on the shore of an underground lake. He showed them how to widen the lake's outlet to the surface and create a fish pond. They agreed to his advice before he had even finished explaining. 12 tribes, 12 chiefs, 2 months' walk, over 400 kilometers across rocky terrain. The map now covered a territory the size of a small kingdom. Kalen stood on the ridge and looked at it. Blue veins of water, yellow dots of ore, thin lines of trails, and 12 warm lights. 12 campsites, 12 peoples whom he had bound together with water and stone. The council at the water in 3 days. The heart of water looked like a wasteland, a flat stone clearing at the junction of 6 gorges, gray stone, not a blade of grass, wind from all directions. Kalen had arrived here a day before the others, alone. He stood in the center and closed his eyes. The map unfolded. Beneath his feet, a layer of memory blazed. The foundation of an ancient temple. A circle of stones laid 1,000 years ago, when the tribes were one people, when everyone gathered here. Chiefs, priests, blacksmiths, shepherds, everyone. Kalen opened his eyes. He took a piece of red clay and began to sketch. He marked out the layout. Here are the red clay. Here are the wind. Here are the salt. Here are the moon. 8 new tribes, each in its own place. The seating arrangement was carefully planned. No tribe sat with its back to a sworn enemy. Next to each was its mediator from the previous year or its closest trading partner. Between the salt and the river tribes lay a distance of 2 stones, because 40 years ago the river tribe poisoned the salt tribe's well. Between the gray stones and the fire tribes, on the other hand, they were close together because their young people have been secretly exchanging obsidian for goat cheese for 3 years now. He had thought through every spot, every corner, every distance, just as he would have built a bridge, just as he would have laid a water conduit, with precision down to a single step. In the morning they began to arrive. Tarn was the first to arrive, the old chieftain of the red clay people, accompanied by Ort and 5 warriors. Tarn looked at the markings, at his own spot, at his neighbor's spots. He grunted. He said nothing. He sat down. The wind people were the second to arrive, the senior elder. With him was Yuna. She scanned the site, found her spot, nodded. Kalen noticed that she hadn't nodded at him, at the markings, like a master nods at another master's work. Then the salt people. Gara sat down heavily on a rock. Rhea stood beside her. The blacksmith had come with a hammer slung over her shoulder, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of her craft. The Moon Clan. Sona led the way. The old priestess remained in the temple. Sona was the delegate, a 19-year-old priestess among chieftains twice and 3 times her age. She sat down and closed her eyes. 10 seconds. She opened them. She looked at Kalen and nodded slightly. All was well. Gray stones, fiery ones, stone owls, bitter herbs, white clays, river folk, river birds. One after another. 12 chiefs, 12 groups. About 80 people on the clearing. People who had never sat together in living memory. Kalen stood in the center. Mir was beside him. She was translating into 3 dialects simultaneously. Her voice was steady. Not a single stumble. She'd been preparing for this day for a week, memorizing phrases. She'd chosen her words carefully, a distinct tone for each tribe. Kalen didn't begin with a speech. He knelt down and spread out a map. Not a paper one, a stone one. 3 days before the council, he'd gathered flat stones and laid them out on the clearing to form a map of Zagoria. Each stone was marked with red, white, or yellow clay. Blue stripes of dyed fabric. Rivers, waterways, underground streams, thin sticks, bridges, trails, roads. The 12 chiefs looked at the stones at their feet, and they saw their land, all together for the first time. Kalen spoke, quietly. Mir translated. He said that each of them was sitting on their own piece of stone, and each piece on its own was poverty. Not enough water, not enough ore, not enough trails, not enough of anything. But if you put the pieces together, you get a land, a rich one, with enough water for everyone, with ore to last 10 generations, with roads stretching from one end of the range to the other. He pointed to the stones. Here are the red clay people. They have clay and pottery skills. Here are the wind people. They have goats and the best guides. Here are the salt people. They have a blacksmith who forges things from copper that others haven't even dreamed of. Here are the moon people. They have knowledge of the stars and ancient records. Here are the fire people. They have obsidian. Here are the river birds. They have fish. Each offers what the others lack, and each receives what they cannot obtain on their own. He fell silent. Silence. The wind swept dust across the rocks. The chief of the fire people spoke first, young, sharp-tongued. He asked who would decide, who would tell whom what to give and what to receive. Kalen replied that everyone would decide, right here, at this spot, every fall. He lays out the map, shows what's there, and the chiefs decide how to divide it. He's not a chief, he's a cartographer. He shows the land. Those who live on it decide. The chief of the fire clan fell silent, he thought. Then he asked, what if two tribes want the same thing, the same vein, the same water, one trail? Kalen said that in that case, he would show them a second vein, a second water source, a second trail, because the land is more generous than they think. It's just that no one has ever looked at it as a whole. Gara raised her hand. Everyone fell silent. The female chief of the salt people rarely spoke, but when she did, everyone listened. She asked about the bone people, about the tribe that hadn't come, the largest in the uplands. 600 people, warlike, vicious. They considered Kalen a demon. If the bone people weren't part of the alliance, then the alliance was only half of the uplands, not the whole. Kalen replied that the bone people would come. Not today, but they would come. Because when the neighbors have water and copper and bridges, and the bone people have only pride and old grudges, even the most stubborn chieftain will start to see reason. Gara snorted. She said that Kalen was either very smart or very young. Kalen replied that one didn't preclude the other. Someone laughed. Quietly. Then someone else. Then laughter swept across the clearing like a wave. The first shared laughter of the 12 tribes. The council lasted 3 days. They argued. They bargained. They argued. Once, 2 chiefs stood facing each other and placed their hands on their knives. Mir stood between them and said 3 words in their common dialect that made both of them sit down. Kalen never found out what she said. Mir smiled and replied that there are some things a translator doesn't translate. By the end of the 3rd day, the 12 chiefs had made their marks on a flat stone. A cross made of red clay, a palm print, a knife mark. Each tribe had its own way of sealing a promise. Kalen stood aside and watched. Mir approached. She stood beside him. She said quietly that he had just made them one people, and he didn't even look up. Kalen replied that he had simply marked the stone. Mir laughed. Briefly, warmly, and he suddenly realized that this laugh had become more important to him than he was willing to admit. The 9th month. Marshal Holbrook's official decree arrived with a merchant who had crossed the mountain range via a smuggler's trail, a document bearing the royal seal. Kalen Rowe was declared a traitor to the state. A bounty was placed on his head, 500 silver coins. For Westmark, the sum was enormous. For Zagor, it was meaningless. Here, silver didn't carry that kind of value, but the decree signaled something else. War, not in a year, in a matter of months. Holbrook was preparing. Kalen assembled a team, not a council of chiefs but his own team. Meyer, Yuna, Sona, Rhea, and Daria. Bran, 5 women and 1 man. They sat around the campfire at the heart of water clearing and studied the stone map by the light of the fire. Daria spoke first, quietly, precisely, just as a scout reports to a commander. Marshal Holbrook will lead the army out in the spring, as soon as the mountain passes open. 10,000 spearmen, 3,000 cavalry, a month's worth of supplies. They'll go through Wolf Pass, the main route, wide, suitable for cavalry and supply trains. Daria knew this because she'd traveled these passes with Kalen for 8 years and knew them like the back of her hand. Kalen listened. He looked at the map. 10,000, against 12 tribes of the Alliance, which together would muster 3,000 warriors. And that's if you count every man and woman capable of wielding a spear. 3 to 1. The numbers weren't in his favor. But Kalen wasn't a commander. He was a cartographer, and the map showed him what the marshal couldn't see. Every pass, every gorge, every water source between Wolf Pass and the Heart of Water. An army isn't just people. An army is people who drink. 10,000 men and 3,000 horses equal 50,000 liters of water a day, every day, without a break. Grey Fangs is dry in winter, snow on the peaks, but down in the gorges, there's only rock and dust. Holbrook is counting on the old wells marked on his maps that Kalen himself drew 8 years ago. Kalen knew every one of those wells, and he knew how to seal them off. Not to poison them, not to block them, to seal them off, to divert the water. His map showed the underground channels that fed every well along the army's route. If stone barriers were placed at the right points and the flow was redirected, the wells would dry up within a week. The water would leave. It wouldn't disappear. It would simply take a different path to where he would build new wells. For his own people, the army would enter the dry mountains. 3 days march without water. On the 4th day, the marshal would listen. He laid out the plan for the team. Una looked at the well locations. Her face was set. She said it was a job for 20 people and 2 months. Kalen replied that they had both. Brand said the marshal would send scouts ahead of the army, hunters just like them. They would find that the wells were dry and report back. Holbrook might change the route. Daria shook her head. She said Holbrook wouldn't change the route, because the Wolf Pass is the only route for the supply train and the cavalry. All the other passes are for foot soldiers, mountain passes, impassable for an army. Holbrook would rather press on and hope to find water further ahead than turn back, because turning back is a disgrace. And for Marshal Holbrook, disgrace is worse than death. Kalen nodded. Daria knew the marshal. She had served under him for 5 years. She understood how he thought. That was invaluable. The second part of the plan involved roads. Over the next 4 months, Kalen was to build something that had never existed in Zagorja before. Real paved roads. Signal towers. Fortresses at key passes. A supply system. Hospitals. Trading posts. Not for war. So that when Holbrook's army crossed the mountain range, it would see not a horde of savages but a country. Rhea listened in silence. Then she asked how many tools would be needed. Kalen named a number. Rhea whistled, low and drawn out. She said she needed a second smithy, and a third, and 10 apprentices. Kalen said they would be provided. Sona listened to everyone. She remained silent. When everyone had left, she stayed behind. She approached Kalen. She said that last night he had been talking in his sleep again, in a language that doesn't exist. Kalen stopped. He asked what he had said. Sona replied that she hadn't understood the words, but she understood the intonation. It was a request. Someone was asking him in his sleep about something important. Kalen was silent. The dreams were becoming more frequent, the humming louder. A warm, heavy hand on his chest now appeared every night. He was beginning to suspect that the map wasn't just a gift, that there was something behind it. Someone. But now was no time for secrets. Now was the time to build. 4 months. A country of stone. He got up and walked toward the mine. Work awaited him. The next 4 months were the hardest of his life. 23 tribes had joined the alliance by the end of the year. 11 new ones came on their own. Rumors were spreading. The tribes saw that their neighbors now had water, copper, and bridges. They saw that the children had stopped coughing. They saw that the elders were living to see spring. And so they came. Kalen worked non-stop. He slept only 4 hours at a time. He wasted away to skin and bones. Meyer forced him to eat. She literally forced him. She would sit next to him and wouldn't leave until he had finished his meal. Rhea sent him food with every supply wagon, a separate bundle containing Z cheese, flatbreads, dried meat. Una once caught him sleeping on the trail, standing up, leaning against a rock. She woke him with a flick on the forehead and said that if he died of exhaustion, she'd have to carry his body down the slope. And he was heavy. Kalen laughed. For the first time in a month, Hana returned in the 10th month. She came alone, without warriors, without weapons. She stood before Kalen and said that her father wouldn't listen, that the Bone Chieftain was gathering warriors, that he'd made a deal with mercenaries from the free cities, Holbrook's money. The Bone clan would attack the alliance from within while the army crossed the mountain range. A two-pronged attack. Kalen asked why she was telling him this. Hana was silent. Then she said that her brother had a lung disease, that he was dying, and that only the Salt people had the cure. But there was bloodshed between the Bone People and the Salt People. Old. Unresolved. Her father would rather let her brother die than ask the Salt People for help. Kalen didn't hesitate. He didn't haggle. He went to Rhea. They spoke quietly. Rhea nodded. 2 days later, the medicine was delivered to Hana through a third party. No strings attached. No debt. No sender's name. When Hana found out who had done it, she came to Kalen. She stood before him. She was silent. Her face was trembling. Then she said she would stay, that she wouldn't return to her father, that she would work for the Alliance. Because a person who saves the child of their enemy without conditions is someone worth following. Kalen accepted her. He didn't ask her anything. He gave her a job. Reconnaissance on the border with the Bone People. She knew their trails and habits better than anyone. The Bone People struck first. At night. At the beginning of the second year, 300 warriors descended on the Riverbird's outermost encampment, a silent attack. Without warning. Kana sounded the alarm 2 hours before the strike. The signal towers went off. Lights raced along the ridge from tower to tower. Kalen stood on the Heart of Water platform and watched as the chain of lights flared up in the darkness. One tower, the second, the third. The system he'd been building for 4 months was working. The Riverbirds had managed to escape. The women and children had taken the trail that Kalen had marked out specifically for the evacuation. Short, hidden, leading to the White Clay's camp where they were being waited for. The Riverbirds' warriors retreated in an orderly fashion. They didn't run. They retreated. According to the plan Daria had devised a week earlier, the Bone People occupied the empty camp. They found extinguished campfires and abandoned belongings. They found no people. Kalen didn't want a battle. A battle means blood. Blood means memory. Memory is new enmity 20 years down the road. He wanted something different. He wanted the Bone People to understand. The map showed the Bone People's encampment's water supply. 3 wells, 2 springs, and 1 underground stream. All were fed by a single aquifer. Kalen knew where that aquifer was. He knew how water flows beneath the rock, and he knew where to set up a barrier. He sent Yuna with 20 men, not warriors but stonemasons. They worked for 3 days and nights. They erected a stone barrier across the underground channel, a 4-hour walk from the Bone People's encampment. The water took a different path. A week later, the Bone People's wells began to run dry. 2 weeks later, they had dried up completely. 600 people without water. Children, the elderly, women. The warriors who had gone to attack the Riverbirds were far away, and the water was running out. Kalen waited. On the 3rd day after the wells had dried up, a delegation from the Bone People arrived at the Union's border. Not warriors. Women. 3 old women, with empty clay jugs. They asked for water. Kalen met them personally. He gave them water. Clean, cold water. From the well he dug on neutral ground the day before. On purpose. The old women drank. Then the eldest of them looked at Kalen. She asked what he wanted. Kalen said he wanted only one thing. For the Bone Clan chief to come and talk. Not to fight, just to talk. And that when the water came, it would return to their wells. That was all. No conditions. No humiliation. The old woman left. 5 days later, the Bone Clan chieftain arrived. An old warrior with eyes white with rage. He stood before Kalen, trembling with rage. He called him a sorcerer, a demon, a water thief. Kalen waited for him to finish speaking. When the chieftain fell silent, Kalen said one thing. He said he could have left the Bone People without water forever. He could have diverted every stream and every spring. The map allows him to do that, but he didn't. Because water isn't a weapon. Water is life. And he doesn't take life. He gives it, even to those who want to kill him. The chieftain listened, his face stony, his hands clenched. Kalen continued. He said he knew about the deal with Holbrook's mercenaries. He knew that the marshal had promised the Bone People the lands of the allied tribes in exchange for an attack from within. And he asked what would happen when Holbrook won, when Westmark's army occupied the uplands. Would the Bone People remain a free tribe, or would they become subjects just like the peasants beyond the ridge? The chief remained silent. He knew the answer. Everyone knew. Westmark doesn't share power. Westmark takes it. Kalen made a proposal. The water is returning. The Bone People join the alliance. Their warriors become part of the defense. Their lands receive a bridge, a mine, an aqueduct, everything the others had received. No debt, no subjugation, as equals. The chieftain looked at Kalin for a long time. Then he turned and walked away. He said neither yes nor no. 2 days later, Kana arrived. She said that half of the Bone people had broken away from her father's rule. 300 people. They had left and set up camp on the border of the alliance. They're asking to be accepted. The chieftain remained with the other half. Old, broken, without water, without half his people, without the mercenaries who, upon learning of the split, had backed out of the deal. Kalin sent men to restore water to the Bone people's wells, all the wells, including the ones that supplied water to the remaining half of the tribe, those who stayed with the chieftain. Hana asked why. They're enemies, after all. Kalin replied that the children drinking from those wells aren't enemies. They're children. Hana turned away. She stood with her back to him. Her shoulders were shaking. Then she turned back. Her eyes were wet. Her face was angry. She said she hated him for what he was doing to her mind, for the fact that every time she thought she understood him, he did something that brought all her defenses crashing down. Kalin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The mercenaries arrived separately. 200 swordsmen from the free cities. They entered through the western passes. Professionals, heavy infantry, armor, iron. Not bone or horn, real iron. Daria and Bran met them at the Stone Ring, the fortress Kalin had been building for 3 months at the main pass. Walls twice a man's height, towers at the corners, a dry but deep moat. The mercenaries looked at the fortress. They looked at the warriors on the walls. They looked at the road beyond the fortress, paved, with signal towers stretching deep into the backlands. Their captain mounted his horse and rode up to the gates. Daria stood on the wall in an old hunter's uniform re-dyed in new colors. The captain asked what he saw. Daria replied that he saw a country that had no intention to die. The captain turned his horse around and led his men away. 200 swordsmen retreated back through the pass. It wasn't worth it. Without the Bone Men and without the mercenaries, Holbrook was left alone. His army and the mountains. Mountains that Kalin knew, and that the marshal did not know. Kalin stood on the wall of the Stone Ring and looked west. Spring was 2 months away. The army would march, and he would be ready. Dawn of the 3rd year. The Stone Ring. The main pass through the Grey Fangs. Kalin stood on the wall and looked south. The map before his eyes was ablaze. 10,000 red dots. Westmark's army. They had been crossing the pass for 3 days already. 3 days without decent water. The wells Kalin had set aside were empty. The horses were staggering. The soldiers carried canteens that clattered with emptiness. Marshal Holbrook was driving them forward. Because turning back would mean admitting that 20 years of dreaming about Zagorje had been a mistake. And for Holbrook, a mistake was impossible. The map showed the column. A long one, stretching across the gorge for 2 hours' march. Cavalry in the lead. The supply trains behind. Westmark's banners. A black eagle on a white field. Kalin knew those banners. He'd marched under them for 8 years. Daria stood beside him. She too was looking south. Her face was calm. Her hands weren't trembling. But Kalin could see her clenching and unclenching her fingers, rhythmically, like a metronome. She was preparing to face her former army, her former comrades, the people with whom she had shared bread and fire. Kalin touched her shoulder, briefly. She nodded. She didn't turn around. She just nodded. He climbed down from the wall. They were waiting below. Meyer stood by the main gate, a map in her hands. Not a stone one, a real one, drawn on tanned goat skin. 3 months' work. Every well, every trail, every fortress, every bridge, every mine, every campsite, the entire country on a single piece of leather. Una stood to the right of the gate, the guide's staff in her hand, a rope and hooks on her belt, ready to lead people along any trail at any moment. Sona stood to the left, dressed in the white robes of a priestess of the Moon tribe, calm, eyes closed. 10 seconds. She opened them, looked at Kalin, nodded. Everything would go as it should. Rhea stood slightly behind them, a hammer on her shoulder. lowered. Not a combat stance, a craftsman's. A blacksmith's hammer, not a warrior's. But it weighed 15 pounds and Rhea knew how to wield it, so it was no small matter. Hana stood last, her hands held out with open palms, a sign of peace among the bone people. The daughter of the chieftain who had wanted to kill Kaelin stood beside him, showing her open palms to his enemies. Along the sides of the road leading from the stone ring down into the valley stood people. Not warriors, people. Blacksmiths, water carriers, shepherds, potters, children, old people. Thousands. 23 tribes. Silent. Each held a small clay bowl of water in their hands. It had been Myra's idea. She'd suggested it a week before that day. She'd said the army had been marching for 3 days without water. The soldiers were exhausted, angry, frightened. If they were met with spears, there would be a battle. If they were met with water, there would be a conversation. Kaelin looked at her then and realized that this woman saw people the same way he saw the land, right through to the core. The army's vanguard appeared from around the bend in the gorge mid-morning. Cavalry. 100 riders. At the front, on a white horse, a man in a black cloak. Marshal Ansel Holbrook, 54 years old, 20 years in power, a man who dreamed of riding right through the Grey Fangs and hoisting his banner over Salt Lake. He reined in his horse. He looked. Ahead lay the road, paved with gray stone, leading down into the valley. People lined the roadside, thousands of them, silent, holding bowls in their hands. On the road stood a single man, unarmed, unarmored, wearing goatskin mountain boots and a cloak that had weathered 2 years of rain and sun. Kaelin stood and waited. The map before his eyes showed everything. The army's positions, the positions of his men, every well, every fortress, every trail. He knew this land down to the last stone. The marshal did not dismount. He sat on his horse and looked down from above. Kaelin knew that look. Holbrook always looked down from above, even when he stood on level ground. Kaelin stepped forward. He dropped to one knee. Not before the marshal, before the road. He unfolded the map. The goatskin spread out over the rocks of the pass. A map of Zagorja, every detail. Holbrook's army positions were marked with a precision that would make any military man's lips turn white. Every regiment, every supply train, every flank group, and nearby, the Alliance's positions. Fortresses, towers, roads, wells, everything. Kaelin spoke. His voice was steady, not loud, but in the silence of the morning, every word carried all the way to the front ranks of the cavalry. He addressed the marshal. He said he'd marched at the head of his army for 8 years, that he knew why the marshal was here, that he wouldn't fight, but he wouldn't let them pass. He told the marshal to look at the road, at the people, at the bowls in their hands. It was a gift for the soldiers. They'd been marching for 3 days without water because Kaelin had sealed off the old wells. But here was water, clean, for every soldier. Let them drink, let them rest, and then they'll sit down and talk, like 2 countries. Because behind Kaelin now lies a country. Silence. Absolute. Even the wind had died down. Even the horses had stopped shifting their hooves. Marshal Holbrook sat on a white horse and watched. At the road. At the people. At the water bowls. At the map on the stones. At the man he'd cast over the ridge 2 years ago with a knife and a half-empty flask. Kaelin saw the marshal's face. He saw his muscles move. How his jaw clenched. How his eyes swept across the road. Across the cobblestones. Across the signal towers. Along the walls of the stone ring. Holbrook was calculating. He'd been calculating his whole life. And now he was calculating again. The soldiers had been without water for 3 days. The horses were on the brink. The supply trains were stretched thin. And ahead lay not a horde of savages. A fortress. Roads. A system. A country. And a man who knows this land down to its very last crack, and who had just laid a map before him showing the positions of both armies. A man who had shown that he knew everything, and that he could have destroyed the army with thirst. But instead, he offered water. Marshal Holbrook dismounted very slowly. Left leg, right. He stepped onto a stone. Kaelin rose from his knee. They stood facing each other. The marshal was half a head taller, broader in the shoulders, 20 years of power behind him. Kaelin was shorter, thin, sun-scorched, 2 years of rock and wind behind him. Holbrook looked at the map at his feet. then at Kalen, then at the people lining the road, at the water bowls. He spoke a single sentence, quietly, so that only Kalen and the nearest horseman could hear. The marshal said that Kalen had always been the best scout in the corps, and that now he understood why. Then he turned to his officers. He gave the order. The army stood at attention. The soldiers began to dismount. The people along the road stepped forward. They held out their bowls. The first soldier took water from the hands of an old woman from the Wind tribe. He looked at her. She looked at him. He drank. He said thank you. The old woman didn't understand the words, but she recognized the voice. She nodded. All along the road, soldiers took water from the hands of the people they had come to conquer. They drank. They were silent. Some sat down right on the rocks. Exhaustion and thirst did what words could not. They made people simply human. The negotiations lasted 7 days. Holbrook bargained hard. 20 years of being accustomed to power don't fade away in a single dawn. But the map lay before him, and every time he demanded a concession, Kalen pointed out on the map what lay behind that concession. This pass here, if you take it, you'll cut off the water supply to 3 encampments. 400 children will be left without water. This mine right here, if you occupy it, 200 families will lose their jobs. He translated every strategic demand into the language of human lives, and the marshal fell silent every time. Not because he was kind, it was because sitting behind him were his own officers, who had been drinking water from these people's hands for 3 days, and who were now looking at the marshal with a question in their eyes. Daria was present at the negotiations. She sat there in her new Union Border Guard uniform. The marshal recognized her. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. She didn't look away, for the first time. On the 7th day, they signed the treaty. The first treaty in history between Westmark and Zagoria. 2 equal states, borders, trade, exchange of artisans, a ban on military action. Kalen did not sign. The leaders signed. 23 marks on the stone, and the marshal's seal, a black eagle imprinted in wax. Holbrook led his army away the next morning. 10,000 men turned and marched back across the pass. Kalen stood on the wall of the stone ring and watched. Meyer stood beside him. Una, Sona, Rhea, Hana, Daria, all 6 of them. Meyer said quietly that 2 years ago he had stood on this pass alone, with a knife and an empty flask, and now he stood with an entire country behind him. Kalen replied that he had simply marked the stone. Meyer shook her head. She said no. He had done more than that. He had taught the stone to be a home. Kalen said nothing. He watched the departing army, the road behind it, the mountains, the sky. The map before his eyes glowed, quietly, warmly. The entire country, every well, every bridge, every trail, every name. He remembered them all. Every child, every old woman, every warrior who had become a stonemason, every stonemason who had become a friend. Deep below, beneath the mountains, the sleeping mother breathed evenly and warmly. He could feel her. He was no longer afraid. She wasn't taking him away. She was simply waiting for him to bind the land into a whole, as it once was. Before the rift, before the grievances, before the bloodshed. He bound it, not all of it, but he had begun, and she was pleased. A warm, heavy hand on his chest. Not in a dream, in reality. He closed his eyes. The map hadn't faded. It would never fade again, because he had walked this land with his own feet. Every stone, every trail, every ravine. He opened his eyes. He looked at Meyer, at Una, at Sona, at Rhea, at Hana, at Daria. 6 women who had walked with him, each for her own reason, each with her own pain, which he had soothed, not with words but with action. He said the work wasn't finished, that 23 tribes weren't 40, that the Bone people weren't yet fully united, that the roads needed to be extended eastward, that 3 gorges still lacked bridges, that on the northern slope lived 6 tribes he hadn't yet reached on foot. Una snorted. She said he could at least stop working for a day. Ray handed him a bundle, cheese and flatbreads, and told him to eat first. Meyer took his hand, quietly, no words. Sona closed her eyes. 10 seconds. She opened them. She smiled. Hana stood slightly to the side. Her arms were crossed, but the corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. Daria looked west, at the retreating army, at the country she had betrayed and was now defending, at the person beside whom she had finally found her place. Kalen was eating cheese and looking at his map, at the country he hadn't conquered, hadn't bought, hadn't received as a gift, a country he had walked across, every stone, one step at a time. He took a bite of his flatbread, stood up, slung his bag over his shoulder, and headed east, toward where the map was still gray, toward where a new land awaited him. 6 pairs of footsteps rustled across the stones behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew they were coming. They would always be coming. Because a road isn't just stone. A road is the people who walk along it together.